Righty. Okie doke. Hey there, hi there, ho there. It's 10th of July, I think. Welcome to Dis and Dat. Long day, probably for even longer for Joe Biden. Anyway, today we're gonna sort of go through the chronological order, at least in one interpretation, in order to get to Marx's theory of surplus value. We're going to do that in a single sitting. There's an article referred to in, I think, the theory of surplus value by Enrique Dussel, done in 2000 or 2001 or so. And there's a variety of explanations for the so-called fourth volume of Capital. And there are many ways to approach the problem, but one that is on the preface for the theory of surplus value is by Dussel, but we'll get to that in a moment. The one on the website for Marxist.org is tries to refer to it in a different way. We find the first direct reference to the fourth historico-literary book of Capital in Marx's letter to Engels, July 31st, 1865. Marx wrote to Engels about how he's getting on with his Capital. So he says there's still 3 chapters to write in order to complete the theoretical part, the first 3 books. And then there's still the 4th book, the historical literary one, to write, which is relatively the easiest part to me, as all the problems have been solved in the first 3 books. And this last is therefore more of a repetition in historical form. Here the question may arise, why Marx says that he still has to write the 4th book of Capital, although in the letter of August 15th, 1863, quoted above, he speaks of the historical part as of something already written. The difference in the formulations of 1863 and of 1865 is to be explained by the fact that in the intervening period, that is, in the course of 1864 to 5, Marx recast and rewrote all three theoretical parts of his work. But the 4th part, historico-literary, was still in the original form as it had been written in 1862-63, and therefore had to be worked over again in conformity with his re-editing of the first 3 volumes of Capital. If you want to think about this, let's just say that he's in the critique of political economy. It's being rewritten every couple of years, in effect, and we've had different versions, and he's fiddling around with this, and in the final form at 1,000 pages, you can imagine how much stuff is being saved, thrown around, re-edited, and we all remember the kind of scrawl that Marx's handwriting is. From Marx's letter of November 3rd, 1877 to Sigmund Schott, it appears that Marx also later on regarded the historical part of Capital as in some degree already written. So in this letter, Marx says of his work on Capital, in fact, I myself began Capital precisely in reverse order, beginning with the 3rd historical part from that in which it is presented to the public, with the qualification, however, that the 1st volume, which was the last to be taken in hand, was prepared for the press straight away, while the 2 others still remained in the raw form that every inquiry originally assumes. Here, the historical part is called the 3rd for the reason that Marx, as has already been mentioned, intended to issue the 2nd and 3rd books of Capital in 1 volume as volume 2, and you're not, now you're really confused. In the 4th book, History of the Theory is the third volume. These statements by Marx entitle us to regard theories of surplus value with the supplementary historical sketches and books from notebooks 20 to 23 as the original and only draft of the fourth book or fourth volume of Capital. Engels and Lenin called Theories of Surplus Value the fourth volume of Capital. So now that you're totally confused, for these reasons, the word volume 4 of Capital have in the present volume been added in round brackets to the title Theories of Surplus Value given by Marx. It is 1861 to 63 manuscript. Now, Theories of Surplus Value was first published by Kautsky in 1905 to 10 and has since then more than once been republished in this Kautsky edition, both in German and in other languages, reproduced several times in Russian. The Kautsky edition has many radical defects, setting out from the totally false assumption that the manuscript Theories of Surplus Value was devoid of any harmonious plan and was something of a chaos. Kautsky subjected it to an arbitrary adaptation, revising the most important principles of revolutionary Marxism. First of all, Kautsky crudely violated the arrangement of the materials set forth by Marx in the table of contents, which he compiled and in fact adhered to in his work. Kautsky completely ignored this table of contents in preparing his edition and did not even include it in the book. So, needless to say, Kautsky distorted this deeply dialectical survey of Marx, tried to subordinate the whole of the material of the manuscript to an external, purely chronological sequence, and to present the course of development of bourgeois political economy as a smooth evolutionary process. So anyway, that's kind of what happens. Kautsky really sort of messed it up. It did it in a very bad way, one might sort of say. And it needed to be sort of reworked. And of course, Kautsky had a problem himself. It's being sort of disavowed, as it were, fleeing to Austria, I guess is what he did. So it, without going through all of the other kinds of Kautsky, in editing Marx's manuscript, Kautsky tried to tone down the annihilating criticism to which Marx subjected the views of the bourgeois economists, and to substitute decorous, sleek expressions for the angry, passionate, caustic language used by Marx. It is merciless criticism of the apologists of the bourgeoisie. Thus, Kautsky, in all passages removed from Marx's characterization of bourgeois economists, such epithets as asses, dogs, and canaille. So anyway, if you really want to consider Marx as the first hip-hop artist, I suppose. So the complete disregard of Marx's table of contents, the arbitrary incorrect arrangement of the manuscript material, the objectivist titles, which avoid the class essence of the conceptions criticized by Marx, the obscuring of the fundamental antithesis between Marxist economic teaching and the whole bourgeois political economy, the removal of a number of passages containing important theses of revolutionary Marxism, from which Kautsky more and more departed. All this suggests that what we have here is not only gross violations of the elementary requirements of the scientific edition, but also the direct falsification of Marxism. Therefore, big problem when you read the 1863 version of Theories of Surplus Value. And what we have today is sort of a codified version that went into, Russian and exists in 3 books. Anyway, the point is that I wanted to get to the 4 drafts of Capital, a book written, the whole Latin American perspective on Marx is really important, and Enrique Dussel is a good example of that. This is from the journal Rethinking Marxism, which is essentially the second rethinking of Marxism, but that's a whole other story. The first century following Marx's death began under Engels' authority, and then continued under the hegemony of the Second International, including Kautsky, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, etc. The Leninist period of the Second International was brief, and it quickly fell under the domination of Stalinism. The second century of Marx, and sort of an interesting way to talk about it, that is 1883 to 1983 is the first century. The second century, we're in the second century, that is 1983 to 2083, has begun with perestroika, with the collapse of existing socialism in Eastern Europe and with the massive publication of hitherto unknown manuscripts. Marx in his second century will be something very different from that in his first century. He'll be a Marx whose critical thought will be in the hands of humanity, critical of capitalism and in a positive way, opening its democratic and creative era of existing socialism. We are perhaps nearer to Marx than ever. Engels himself, too often confused in his we, that is Marx and I, what belonged to Marx and what Engels had added. Moreover, due to an understandable defensiveness, he could not take a clear archaeological vision of Marx's theoretical discoveries as we can today, thanks to the discoveries we will discuss in this article. Kautsky, Lenin, and many other subsequent Marxists had even less access to the texts with which we are now acquainted. It is a question then of a complete rereading of Marx with new eyes. As a Latin American from the growing poverty of the peripheral world, the underdeveloped and exploitative capitalism at the end of the 20th century, Marx is in the periphery, that is in center periphery, today more pertinent than in the England of the mid-19th century. So the introduction to the four drafts of Capital, Marx is interpreted for 5 decades from the standpoint of Stalinism, itself a deformation so evident that it is not necessary even to discuss it. For its part, so-called Western Marxism from Lukács and Korsch up to Kosisch, Marcuse, Althusser, Coletti, or Habermas, philosophically explored, especially the young Marx, although Lukács is the exception, especially in his mature work on the ontology of social being. In any case, initially one depended on the materials published by Engels and Kautsky. So when in 1925, the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 were published, on which Marcuse so astutely commented, a rediscovery of Marx was begun. The Grundrisse, published in 1939 and in 1954, did not have the same effect. Roman Radulski's book from 1967 was the first important discussion of that work. It somewhat modified the traditional vision of Marx, but not fundamentally. The Hegelianism of Marx, proposed already by Lukács, would be denied by Althusser or Coletti against all the evidence. For my part, exiled from Argentina, where the right-wing Peronist and military repression was beginning, as in Germany of 1933, in 1977, at the UNM, the National University, the National Free University, Autonomous University of Mexico, I began a seminar which we reread chronologically, archaeologically, Marx's economics works, from the least to most remote drafts, from the viewpoint of the publication of Capital. The fruits of this seminar have been the 3 volumes that I've published on the subject in Spanish. Having initiated a complete rereading with the intention of diachronically, meaning in historical order, discovering the construction of the categories in Marxist theory, we began with his baccalaureate examinations in 1835, his doctoral thesis of 1841, his articles of 1842 to 3, and the beginning of his exile. We studied at length the works of Paris and Brussels, given that at the end of 1843, Marx began his studies of economics, which continued until 1849. This part of his life has been sufficiently studied by contemporary philosophy, especially by the polemic of Althusser's epistemological break. To us, however, the subsequent period appeared more interesting. Marx left for London in 1849. There, every day beginning in 1851, in the library of the British Museum, he undertook a huge task of reading in which he left us testimony in the more than 100 notebooks that will represent more than 40 volumes in Section 4 of the MEGA. Up until now, we've only had the first 7 volumes, that is Mega 4 and 1 through 7, but this is not the section of the Mega with which we are primarily interested. The hitherto unknown manuscripts have been published in German since the 1970s in the authoritative Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe. Over 100 volumes, therefore, hereafter referred to as MEGA, first by the Marx Engels Institute of Berlin and Moscow, and more recently by the International Institute of Social Sciences in Amsterdam. Most, although not all, of these manuscripts have been published in English translation as part of the 50-volume collection, Marx Engels Collected Works, which is the MECW by International Publishers. That's the big Russian version, which was the dominant version used by most of us. The important 1861-63 manuscript is published in full in volumes 30 to 34 of this English collection. Unfortunately, Marx's original draft of volume 3 of Capital in his 1863 to 65 manuscript, which differs in some respects from Engels' edited version, with which we're all familiar, will not be published in this English collection. These manuscripts are discussed in greater detail further on. Chronologically rereading these manuscripts of Marx, we reached 1857, and promptly we discovered, since it was a team reading with students trained in a strict reading of Marx, the massive presence of Hegel in the so-called Grundrisse, the first draft of Capital. With the reading and debate thus completed, we learned of other manuscripts, Marx 1861, that had just been published in Berlin. We studied these manuscripts in teams, archaeologically, observing how Marx developed the concept of capital through the construction of new categories. In November and December 1857, Marx discovered the category of surplus value. From November 1862 to January 1863, he finished constructing, in definitive fashion, the category of price of production. Thus, we became aware that this was the second draft of Capital, that is, the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. With this work finished, we set out to obtain the next materials in the archives in Amsterdam and in the Marxist-Leninist Institute of Berlin, where we were received and where the doors were open for us to read the manuscripts. We discovered in 1987 the existence of the manuscripts of 1863 to 65, the third draft of Capital. We had thus closed the circle and could now consider the fourth draft of Capital, the 1867, which Marx took up in January 1866, the work with which the entire Marxian tradition has begun reading Marx. We had, for the first time, a complete vision of Marx's manuscripts. We could only then attempt a proper interpretation, one that did not necessarily depend on the other existing European interpretations, and one that would respond to the concrete historical interests of Latin American poverty and to the necessity of a revolutionary process in the periphery of the capitalist world at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. I believe that this Marx will be not only the Marx of perestroika, but also the Marx of the entire second century, that is 1983 to 2083, of the philosopher and economist who critically deconstructs capitalist economics and reconstructs it anthropologically and ethically in a democratic vision in which the responsible and participating individual is fully realized in the community and in solidarity. What is crucial is to describe the critical framework from which Marx criticized capitalism, since it is from that framework that one may criticize as well as all possible future economic systems. So the four drafts go from 1857 to 80. Let us first examine in a purely external fashion the problematic presented by the interpretation of Marx's work, by the fact of his having written Capital four damn times. So the Grundrisse, 1857 to 8, is the first draft of Capital. So when on the 23rd of August, 1857, Marx began another notebook, one of many, he certainly was not aware that he was beginning the 10 most creative years of his life in terms of theoretical production, precisely from 1857 to 1867. Contrary to what is seen to be a total absence of a philosophical problematic, to say nothing of Hegelianism, in Marx, he wrote a few months later in 1858, the fact that by mere accident, I again glanced through Hegel's logic. Fellengra found some volumes of Hegel which originally belonged to Bakunin and sent them to me as a present, has been of great service to me as regards the method of dealing with the material. Today we know, moreover, that Marx again reread Hegel's logic in 1860 and that he even wanted to write a popular pamphlet to show the importance of Hegelian logic. It is a philosophical paradigm in which the rational nucleus of Hegel is inverted but used nonetheless in its entirety. This is from which the whole inversion of Hegel, that dialectical materialism, is built, from which Hegel began to develop the economic concept of capital. Suddenly, while working on the Proudhonian Daruma, Marx abandoned the literary style of the commentary and began the development of his own discourse. This is the definitive Marx, and the one for which all the earlier moments of his life, that is 1837 to 57, were scientific preparations according to Marx's concept of science. From October 1857 until the publication of Capital in 1867, Marx's dialectical discourse never paused except for a few months between 1859 and the summer of 1861. He went on constructing, constituting one by one his categories. In the Grundrisse, Marx already expounded in a manner both inspired and unexpected, perhaps even to himself, but showing along with it the rational logic of its discourse, the nearly definitive order of capital. There are some differences. For example, the discussion of money, Marx 1857, 1973, allows him to discover the distinct problematic, and up to that point, in no way the subject of this investigation of capital. It is in the dialectical construction of the concept of money that Marx discovered for the first time in his life the importance of the concept of capital. As the permanence, that is the conservation and the process, the movement, the sense of being in Hegel, the Bewegenheit that Marcuse studied in his doctoral thesis on Hegelian ontology of value. Money is not the same as money as capital. From the appearance that the Erscheinung of circulation, he returned to the foundation, the Grundrisse, or the essence, the Wesen. Having arrived at this point, Marx went backwards to what will be the absolute condition of possibility of the existence of capital, the question of the transformation of money into capital, the question with which he will begin all three later drafts of Capital, the radical beginning of the whole of Capital. And this is already a profound interpretive conclusion in contradiction with the entire Marxian tradition, and especially with Lukács or Marcuse. For Hegel and for Marx, the foundation, the Grundrisse, is value, or better, the valorization of value. It is the essence of capital. Totality, as the point of departure, is enunciated in the following way. The separation of property from labor appears as the necessary law of this exchange between capital and labor. Labor posited as not capital, as such, is non-objectified labor. Conceived negatively, this living labor, this complete denudation, purely subjective existence of labor. Labor is absolute poverty, an objectivity not separated from the person, only an objectivity coinciding with his immediate bodily existence. Non-objectified labor conceived positively, subjective existence of labor itself, labor not as an object, but as activity, not as itself value, but as the living source of value. This text is also present at the beginning of the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, and must have been equally present in the manuscripts of 1863 to 65. It is also the same logico-dialectical place in the definitive 1867 edition of Volume 1 of Capital. For the exteriority of living labor, which is neither the capacity for labor nor labor power, a denomination that Marx does not use with certainty until 1866. From the transcendental poverty, the pauper, as Marx writes, of the person, subjectivity, corporeality of the worker as not capital, nicht capital. Transcendental, then, with respect to the totality of capital, the living labor is subsumed. Subsumption is the trans-ontological act par excellence that negates exteriority and incorporates living labor into capital in the labor process. It is from this perspective that Marx quickly set himself the problem of how surplus value appears and thereby discovered for the first time in his life the question of surplus value. The surplus value which capital has at the end of the production process is greater than that which was present in the original components of capital. He then went on to discuss in more detail what he later called relative and absolute surplus value. He also discussed sui generis the whole problematic of the devalorization of capital, on which he never again would focus with such clarity. The realization of capital, finally, is the derealization of living labor, its non-being. Similarly, in the Grundrisse, Marx presented in exemplary fashion a description of the pre-capitalist modes of appropriation, destroying the unilinear and thereby necessary schema of succession, that is, primitive, slave, feudal, capitalist, and socialist modes of production so foreign to the spirit of Marx. Exteriority is concerned with those moments before or after the subsumption of living labor into capital. Totality is concerned with the level of the system in all its parts. Capital as totality indicates the structure of all that is subsumed by a mode of production whose objective is surplus value. Totality should not be confused with all reality, but only with all the component parts of a system. It is the ontological level of the comprehensiveness of being, the valorization of value as the foundation of all the internal determinations of capital. From then on, Marx was able to discover the concept of each determination of capital, that is, commodity, money, labor, power, means of production, product, and so on, the standard equation. MCM with C being divided into labor, power, and means of production. Within the movement of capital in its productive moment, Marx then analyzed the process in the moment of circulation. A few pages on, the future book served to outline the entire problem of capital and profit. The richness of the Grundrisse cannot even be suggested in these few lines. What is certain is that Marx completed the Grundrisse in June 1858. A few months later, between August and November 1858, he wrote the Urtext, that is the original text of Capital, a short text on the commodity and money, and began chapter 3 on capital, but then he abandoned it. So that sort of polishes off the first draft, which is the rediscovered Grundrisse. And so the second draft of Capital is the manuscripts of 1861 to 3. We should see the contribution to the critique of political economy as the beginning of the manuscripts of 1861 to 1863. In effect, Marx first wrote the chapter on the commodity and then that on money, but he hesitated and promised to write a future chapter 3 on capital. So it would be CMC, ultimately, the sort of. It was the first definitive draft of what later became part 1 of volume 1 of Capital. It is interesting because one can see the development with regard to the Grundrisse and also the immaturity with regard to the later drafts of 1867 and 1873. It's worth noting that for 10 years, from 1857 to 1867, Marx did not return to this subject of part 1 of volume 1. And this is why there's this huge, thing about part 1 in volume 1, and then literally the first chapter, the problem of the first chapter. Marx's draft of part 1 for the 1867 edition shows a lack of theoretical advance on this subject during that period. For this reason, the later 1873 edition of chapter 1 includes many variations and some important ones. What is certain is that in August 1861, with a 2-year pause at that time, Marx once again took up his pen to undertake in a single stretch a theoretically very creative period from 1861 in August until April 1867, without any important breaks, though with some minor ones owing to the illnesses that continually besieged the Marx of London. darn carbuncles. He would write 23 notebooks that we'll call the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, published as a whole for the first time and without Engels or Kautsky's modifications between 1977 and 1982 in the MEGA, that is Section 2, Volume 3, Books 1 to 6. This is a huge amount of material that has not attracted sufficient attention from Marxist scholars. Well, since then, there's been a tremendous attention to it. So that being written in 2001, the last 20 years has been people spending a heck of a lot of time in it, including Heinrich and et cetera, Molesley, blah, blah, blah. The structure of the manuscripts of 1861 to 63 can be divided to simplify into three parts. The first, from notebooks 1 to 5, is a quasi-definitive text and hitherto unknown second draft of Volume 1 of Capital on the transformation of money into capital, which is part 2, and on absolute and relative surplus value, parts 3 and 4. Once Marx clarified these problems, that is, having definitively constituted was essential to those categories, he could confront the history of economics, to ask himself what economists had said on the subject, and by confrontation to observe if his categorical framework resisted criticism. It is not a history, and therefore has nothing to do with a book 4 of Capital, nor is the history the most important part. What is truly interesting in what we have developed in our commentary is the development of Marx's categorical framework. That is, in confronting Stuart in Notebook 6 in March 1862, for example, the most important thing for the reader of the manuscript is not to see what he critiques, but rather in what sense he begins to develop new categories. The creation of new categories is not foreseen in Marx's plan, given that it is only a formal historical framework. One must read the text then obliquely. One must see not only what he criticized, but how it is criticized, with what categories is criticized, which new categories appear. So the whole concept of categories becomes important. And as I would assert, the mathematical approach to it that Badiou looks at is sort of filled with this kind of idea to suggest that categories made mathematical and set theory, for example, is supposed to be useful. That is, one needs a epistemological attention. That is, in the first place, terminological. In this case, words count. And the translations into English or into Spanish, where they exist, and many of these texts are not translated from the original German, sometimes betray Marx. It's a question then of pursuing not only the words, but also their semantic contents. Frequently, the word is the same, but not its content, its concept. Other times, the words change. For example, cost price and price of production, but the concept is identical. These fluctuations, variations, transformations indicate an immature state in the constitution or construction of some categories. When Marx has finished constructing a term, he gave a definitive name for the concept. The most paradigmatic case is the following. All economists share the error of examining surplus value not as such in its pure form, but in the particular forms of profit and rent. That is to say, the name surplus value has one concept, such as it has been described in the first notebooks. Its phenomenal forms of appearance in the superficial and more complex world of commodities are profit or rent, which have two distinct concepts that with surplus value make three concepts. Nonetheless, economists confuse them by conflating them as just one concept. It is then a question of separating, distinguishing concepts and giving them diverse names to avoid confusion. An entire theory of the constitution of the category should be developed here, but for that purpose, we have written the 3 volumes of commentary. Perhaps the most creative moment is when Marx handles the question of rent, when departing from the position of Robertus, and in the critique thereof, he develops the concept of the organic composition of capital, monopoly, and so on. The fundamental category that Marx discovers in the manuscripts of 1861 to 3 is price of production, which also allows him to explain absolute rent. These subjects no longer correspond to volume 1 of Capital, but rather the portion of the dialectical discourse that we elaborated in volume 3 of Capital from the more concrete perspective of competition. Without a previous program, one subject that is also treated frequently is the question of reproduction. The manuscript finishes on questions of volumes 2 and 3, that is, mercantile capital, etc., profit, etc., and also those pertaining to volume 1, where for the first time, Marx clears up the question of the real subsumption of living labor. This is pretty important to Dussel. Now, on to the third draft. And we're proceeding in these, sort of small leaps, but we're now in 1863, the manuscripts of 1863 to 65, the third draft of Capital. In July 1863, Marx completed the indicated manuscripts, and at that same month began the manuscripts of 1863 to 65. These include more than 1,220 handwritten folios, which began to be published in the Amiga in 1988. Section 2, Volume 4. Included among them is the famous unpublished Chapter 6, published in English as an appendix to the Vintage Books edition of Volume 1 of Capital and entitled Results of the Immediate Process of Production. This was the only time in Marx's entire life that he completely wrote all 3 volumes of Capital. This is, moreover, the only complete text, although in certain parts only a sketch of volumes 2 and 3. It should be kept in mind that this draft of volume 1, except for a few scattered pages, and that unpublished chapter 6, the unpublished chapter 6 is online, and is entitled Results of the Immediate Process of Production. It should be kept in mind that this draft of volume 1, except for a few scattered pages in the unpublished chapter 6, have been lost. I believe it was so similar to the text of the 4th draft that Marx destroyed it as he finished modifying or copying it. The materials that remained from this draft of volume 1 have been recently published in the Amiga, that is a detailed commentary in the 1990 Dussel chapter 1. This book has 495 manuscript folios. It is divided into the following 6 chapters: transformation of money into capital, absolute surplus value, relative surplus value, combination of both surplus values, and the problem of wages, accumulation, and the results of the production process of capital. As can be seen, there was still no idea of including an introductory chapter or part, given that the subject had been expounded in 1859 in the contribution to a critique of political economy, the 1859. Here, Marx handled the problem of the formal and real subsumption, a question that would remain insufficiently addressed in the 4th draft due to the elimination of that unpublished chapter 6. And if you're not confused now, you're really confused. In the London summer of 1864 until December of that year, Marx began the draft of volume 3. The texts display a great similarity to the thematic of volume 1, that is, the passage of surplus value, deep, essential value, simple, to profit, that is, profit's form of phenomenal appearance, superficial and complex. These are magnificent texts of great Hegelian precision. Marx is Hegelianized more and more until 1880, 3 years before his death, in complete control of his phenomenology, of the levels of the abstraction, of the systematic dialectic of the categories, that is, of a fully scientific exposition. If by science one understands the passage from the phenomenal, from the visible, to consciousness, to the essence, to the invisible. This is the principal manuscript, or manuscript 1 of volume 3, published for the first time in the Amiga in 1992. Now, this may seem totally trivial, but there are generations of people who studied this from the middle period of the New Left in the late 60s, early 70s, all the way up to the 1990s, not having read, kind of these sort of undiscovered manuscripts. And not that this is like biblical inerrancy or anything, but the fact is, there is a kind of excavation of all of these texts, and that is kind of, it's important that people are kind of putting this all together. This is the same reason why people get into arguments about, what did he mean by this one word, and that you build an entire, sort of ecological theory, for example, with on the sort of presence or absence of one word. Around December 1864 or January 1865 at the latest, Marx interrupted the draft of Volume 3 and wrote a draft of Volume 2 in one stretch. Marx included at the end, in the 5th paragraph of Chapter 3, the problem of accumulation with money, a question not included in the subsequent edition of Engels. Engels ignored this manuscript, not knowing that it was the only complete one. The whole problematic of Volume 2 can now be truly dealt with, and for the first time in the history of Marxism. In the middle of 1865, after having finished the draft of Volume 2, Marx returned to Volume 3. At the same time, he delivered his address on wages, price, and profit, where the subjects he had left to write are evident when he says, rent, interest, and industrial profit are different names for different parts of the surplus value of the commodity. This is why wages, prices, and profit were referred to a lot in the 70s, for example. The book ends in the 7th chapter on interest. That is, on the question of fetishism, where he repeats many of the reflections carried out at the end of the so-called theories of surplus value of 1863. We've commented on the immense interest of all of this in our detailed commentary, that is, the 3 volumes by Dussel. In December 1865, Marx had, for the first time in his life, the 3 books of his work before his eyes like an organic whole. It is the first part of 4 parts of his planned treatise on capital. The remaining ones, competition, credit, and stock capital, which is the first of 6 planned treatises, the remaining ones being rent, wages, the state, international relations, and the world market. All of this against Rudolsky's interpretation, as we have demonstrated in our commentaries, continues to be the fundamental plan of his entire work. Capital is only the beginning. And now, the 4th draft, 1866 to 1880, sort of the thing that he sort of fiddles around with at the end of his life, but yet we know that, he's reading all kinds of other stuff. And in the final 3 years of his life, 1880 to 1883, he's looking at all kinds of strange things, different things that I think are really important, that really suggests the kind of scientific move that he was making, stuff on geography, geology, science, natural history, soil stuff, etc. Archaeologically, diachronically, only now can we open the first pages of the definitive Capital. But no, in fact, Marx began the draft with Chapter 2, the transformation of money into capital, that later became Part 2 in the 1873 version. From the exposition at the International the year before, Marx was convinced that everything he had written in 1859 had been completely forgotten. It was necessary to write an introductory chapter on the commodity and money. This is the issue of, when you read the Volume 1, you get this, that, as I've suggested, this kind of front loading. And this is an example of why there is a kind of front loading. The subject had not been addressed in the last 8 years, but in any case, he left his introductory chapter for the end, for 1867. And this is not unimportant. Capital, its dialectical, logical, essential discourse begins with the transformation of money into capital. On this will rest the fundamental aspect of our pretension to a total reinterpretation of the dialectical discourse of Marx. Marx began the 4 drafts with each chapter on capital, a chapter that became a section, a book, 3 books, and finally 4 books and 3 volumes. The question of the commodity and money were necessary assumptions for the explanation, that is, to know what money is, that is, objectified living labor. But capital begins when, from circulation and as a contradiction, living labor is subsumed in a labor process that is the first emergence of capital by the negation of money as money in the payment of the first wage. Now, I know this is difficult to follow, but this idea is that you can see the kind of circuit thinking that Marx has about starting with this idea of that is a new sort of abstract idea of commodity, or a reframing of the idea of a commodity, and then showing its relation, to money, then to capital, and seeing the question of money as a kind of negation of negation, seeing it in a Hegelian way, that's kind of really important. So, quote, whose use in the payment of the first wage, whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, a creation of value. The possessor of money does find such a special commodity on the market, the capacity for labor. In other words, labor power. Now, remember, this is an abstraction. The capacity for labor is not labor itself. This capacity for labor as an abstraction is really, the important move that he makes to try, as many interpreters have had, how is it that you can define the capacity for labor? And does it occur in the subsumption, in the movement of subsumption? As can be observed, Marx doubts, he vacillates in using capacity of labor or labor power 3 times in one page. Will give both denominations, even inverting their order. Finally, he decided in writing these pages on the denomination labor power, a terminological decision made in January 1866 for the first time in his life. Capacity for labor perhaps explained better than labor power the conceptual content of the matter. Capacity for labor is a kind of expectation. If you call it labor power, it becomes more reified, right? But I hope you can see that distinction, that it is a kind of expectation, as it were, for the labor. Chapters 2 to 4, and later parts 2 to 4, the transformation of money into capital, absolute and relative surplus value, offered no difficulty, given that since 1861, the matter had received quasi-definitive clarity. Nonetheless, suddenly in the chapter on the working day, he went far beyond the plan, and the work began to take on an unexpected proportions. The same thing happened with the chapter on machinery and modern industry, which also ascends to more concrete levels. If you will recall in our reading, he spends a lot of time on the development on the role of machinery and replacing labor. Chapter 5 is more complex. In it, in a still rather confusing fashion, various problems are posed, as can be observed in successive levels of this part. He includes here subjects such as productive and unproductive labor, formal and real subsumption, fetishism, price of labor power, etc. This chapter 5 is later divided into 2 parts, 5 and 6, in the 1873 edition. Chapter 6 on accumulation closes the book. Upon completing the manuscript, Marx must have written chapter 1, later to become part 1. Upon finishing it, and after reading the text, Kugelmann suggested that Marx elaborate the question of the form of value. So Marx added an appendix, form of value, in 1867, which clarified the question of the relative and equivalent forms of exchange value. In footnote 9 of chapter 1, Marx noted that when we employ the word value with no other additional determination, we refer always to exchange value. This footnote disappeared in 1873 because Marx, for the first time in his life, at the very earliest in 1872, distinguished between value and exchange value. Now, the famous text on the fetishism of the commodity in section 4 of chapter 1 in the last work to be published by Marx in 1873 can be explored in more detail. The chapter with which many began reading Marx is precisely the last of his published work, in which Marx introduced the question of fetishism that would have taken its natural place at the end of volume 3 ahead of time, perhaps realizing that the remaining books might not be finished for publication. We now think, for the first time in the history of Marxism, a detailed study in a diachronic, synchronic, and semantic fashion of the constitution of the text can now begin. So here we are in 2001, is Dussel saying what he thinks the chronology looks like. And so, this is the way that he thinks it sort of unfolds. After the publication of volume 1, Marx worked relatively little on the manuscripts of volume 2 and 3. On the other hand, he immersed himself in an enormous investigation of the agrarian problem in Russia and many other subjects related to these subjects. What is certain is that Marx, challenged by the young Russian populace, especially by Danielson, had to take fundamentally new directions in his investigation. In response to Mihailovsky's critique in 1877, Marx wrote, "The chapter on primitive accumulation pretends only to trace the path by which in Western Europe the capitalist economic system surged from the womb of the feudal system." And as we read before, in response to Zasulich in 1881, he is still more clear. The analysis of capital offers no reason for or against the vitality of the Russian rural commune, but the special study that I've realized, for which I search for materials and original sources, has convinced me that this commune, the Russian commune, is the fulcrum for the social regeneration of Russia. Capital will have to be developed on more concrete levels, not only in the central capitalist countries, England and Western Europe, but also in the peripheral countries, from 19th century Russia to 20th century Latin America, Africa, or Asia. We have now arrived at the end of the description, purely external, of the four drafts of Capital. The corpus of the text is at our disposal. We will have to explore it slowly in the first years of this second century of Marx. For the first time, we have before our eyes the totality of the materials necessary for understanding what Marx attempted theoretically to express. So it's just important to remember that this does unfold in a kind of linear order, but he does jump back and forth. And there are some, ideas that don't get fully completed, but you can see that interpreters of Marx, especially the Russians, began to pick up on certain things and sort of thought, well, maybe we can jump ahead. Can we jump ahead of can we jump over capitalism, in other words? There's a whole bunch of ideas fluttering around, partially because you have all these anarchists running around who sort of think, no, maybe it should be this way as opposed to, a kind of progression. And this is a key element. It is the reason why some people move towards a more evolutionary sort of form of thinking about communism, like Kautsky. Well, if anything, Kautsky got to live longer, so that's maybe a good thing in exile. Some possible interpretive hypotheses. We're almost to the end. Faced with the totality of the preparatory and definitive manuscripts of Capital, we believe that we can pose certain hypotheses to begin the debate on the interpretation of such a huge work that has moved world history to its foundations since the end of the 19th century. Now, this is Dussel's sort of explication on this living labor versus objectified labor. And so this addressing of the logic of capital is to think of, well, perhaps this idea of the capacity to labor as opposed to labor power. That's the same kind of difference. The dialectical logic movement of capital begins in the radical contradiction of living labor and objectified labor as capital. In the Or text, that is the original version, 1858, Marx expressed this contradiction in the following way. The only contradiction to objectified labor is non-objectified labor. It is the contradiction between objectified labor and subjective labor, the labor as capacity, possibility, faculty, labor capacity as living subject. Only the living capacity of labor constitutes the absolute contradiction with capital as objectified labor. So this is, sort of, you can see where all this value form stuff goes on, that people are trying to come to grips with the kind of thinking of a kind of abstraction that occurs phenomenologically, that occurs in its realization. The fundamental distinction in all of Marx's thought is not between abstract labor and concrete labor, nor is the difference between use value and exchange value. It is rather, and without Marx himself realizing it, that's a bit of a stretch, the difference between living labor and objectified labor. The fact that living labor is confronted by past labor activity, is confronted by the product. Man is confronted by things. Labor is confronted by its own materialized condition as alien, independent, and self-contained subjects, personifications. In short, as somebody else's property, and in this form as employers and commanders of labor itself, which appropriate it instead of being appropriated by it. So you can see this interesting little inversion going on of that is Hegelian. That is, sort of you get this kind of tension between the two. Living labor as the absolute point of departure of the dialectical discourse prior to the existence of capital as creative source of value from the nothing of capital is a person, a subjectivity, an immediate corporeality. But at the same time, living labor is absolute poverty, the pauper par excellence. Nonetheless, this creative source is subsumed, incorporated into capital, founded as mediated for the valorization of the value of capital. The source is posited from the foundation as instrument. Capital is now realized not only as value, which reproduces itself and is hence perennial, but also as value, which posits value. It relates as the foundation to surplus value as that which it founded. Surplus value appears no longer to be posited by its simple direct relation to living labor. Capital relates to itself as producing value. Marx distinguished then living labor as source to be distinguished from foundation value as the being of capital prior to and in exteriority as creative source that is not the same as productive. It produces itself from the value of wages in necessary time. It creates itself from the creative source beyond the foundation, beyond value. It creates itself from surplus labor time through surplus labor from the nothing of capital to surplus value. Now, I know that, this may be problematic for all kinds of reasons, but it's an interesting hypothesis that Dussel is making. Living labor, the non-being prior to the totality of Lukács and described by Martin J. Martin J. is the author who really gives us a more definitive history, anyway, of the Frankfurt School, is the generative category for all Marx's remaining categories. The non-reference to living labor of any category constitutes the fetishistic character of each of them. The worker surrenders his creative power. He necessarily impoverishes himself because the creative power of his labor establishes itself as the power of capital. As an alien power confronting him, he divests himself of labor as the force productive of wealth. The development of the concept of capital through the construction of categories, which is the dialectical work of Marx and capital, is accomplished step by step, departing from living labor and subsequently unfolding all the moments of objectified labor. Value, that is value, surplus value, and so on, culminating in accumulation. First circuit. In reproduction, second circuit. In the distribution of surplus value by class as profits or rent, in the third circuit. That's packing a lot of stuff in there, but it is these three circuits, and as we've discussed, the idea that they are overlapping or nested. These three circuits, like a spiral, constitute the three books of Capital, which we have discussed in detail in the 3 volumes of commentary. Note that that's exactly what Higginbottom is doing when he tries to show the relationship of the 3 books. Marx succeeded in publishing only 1/72nd of his plan. God. Only the production of capital, the first of 3 parts on capital in general, which is the first of 4 parts of the treatise on capital, which is the first of 6 projected theses. That is 3 times 4 times 6, 72. This makes clear the importance of understanding well the method used by Marx in the beginning of his exposition in order to later ourselves develop his dialectical discourse at more concrete levels, as, for example, that of Latin American peripheral capitalism. And this is a really important issue for particularly those Latin American scholars because of the dominance of certain theories of, center periphery issues, which are, a variety of questions that are part of thinking about revolution, that are also part of thinking about capital, et cetera. So this is Dussel again, still hypothesizing in that sense. Critique of political economy, a transcendental ethic. The inversion of the rational nucleus of Hegel consists in beginning with non-being, that is living labor, as the creative source, as in Schelling, from the nothing of being, that is value and surplus value of capital. this, like the other paragraph I looked at before, is this, you have to see that this is all in the movement between non-being and being, and done as a form of negation, a dialectical negation. This is the Hegelian stuff that Marx is using. Once subsumed, living labor becomes a determination of capital, labor power that is consumed in the productive process of capital. Now, the Hegelian logic functions perfectly. Marx always remained a Hegelian in the use of the ontological dialectic of totality, but at the same time, he infused in that totality a novelty that always comes to capital from outside. This is where we get that entry point stuff that Rick Wolf likes, and that Althusser talks about. That always comes to capital from outside, from the creative transcendentality of living labor, because though living labor has been subsumed, it remains created from the nothing of capital, from its subjectivity, which can produce value beyond its wage. You can see that the idea of exploitation is in fact this kind of dehumanizing sort of element that, I mean, if you want to project upon it, this idea that something is being taken away in the process of negation. It is in August 1862, when Marx studied the question of rent in the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, that he discovered for the first time in his life the importance of the law of value. On the 9th of August in 1862, he wrote to Engels, "The only thing I've got to prove is the possibility of absolute rent without violating the law of value. Ricardo denies this possibility. I maintain that it exists." Now, recall, I'm making an aside here, recall that current analysis of this, there's a certain branch of Marxist analysis that suggests that you hold, that absolute rent may not exist. So this, or you hold it at zero and then you do all your other stuff. And so this kind of assumption is incredibly problematic by some people's interpretation. In the 2020s, that's kind of where some people have gone, only because it makes the math work better. The law of value indicates that exchange value can have no other source than living labor. Neither land nor any other thing except the human being can produce exchange value. Land can only produce use value. By not being products of labor, the person or the subjectivity of living labor and land cannot have an exchange value. They can have use value, or even thinking today about the contemporary ecological question, they can have dignity, ecological or ontological value, as the classics would say, but they cannot have economic exchange value, which is the one to which Marx refers. For this reason, and this is the first conclusion drawn from the difference between living labor and objectified labor, living labor cannot have exchange value, and the price of labor is a category without content, because it is the substance or effective cause of value, while capacity for labor or labor power has exchange value because it can be consumed and can reproduce itself. The law of value unifies and solidifies the development of the concepts and the constitution of the categories, referring all of them to living labor as the sole creative source. In this lies the interest of the question of rent in the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, not so much for the solution, but rather for the rational intention of Marx's whole theoretical task. It is a manner of demonstrating the coherence, the fundamentality, the rational articulation of the whole system of categories presupposed in bourgeois political economy, but denied it by its incoherence, irrationality, constant contradictions. It is a matter then of the general criticism of the total system of the categories of economics. Marx then attempts a critique of the actual economy and bourgeois economic science, a critique from the transcendentality of living labor ante festum, as Marx liked to write, a priori, because it is the temporal and logical presupposition of the existence of capital, a question developed in the problematic of the transformation of money into capital, as we have shown. The transcendentality follows the very development of the dialectical movement itself, since living labor at every movement of development put into effect its labor process, accumulation, reproduction, distribution, etc., or dialectical theorists as the scientific exposition of the system of categories continues to manifest its beyondness in relation to value. That is the question of how is surplus value created. In this case, it is no longer a priori exteriority, but rather continuous internal transcendentality in festum. but and finally, it is a posteriori, post festum transcendentality as useless labor of the unemployed, or as labor that frees itself from capitalism to constitute a different mode of production. For example, that of existing socialism, where it will be subsumed within a different logic, but not therefore less subsumed, and with a new, not the same, kind of alienation. And so, from this transcendentality, pre, in, and post to capital, Marx realized his critique, a transontological, if ontology is about being, critique, an ethical critique, if by ethics is understood the transcendental critique of all constituted effective morality, like the bourgeois morality that Marx so criticized. So it's nonsense. It is Marx. It is nonsense for Gilbart to speak of natural justice in this connection. The content is just as long as it corresponds to the mode of production and is adequate to it. It is unjust as soon as it contradicts it. Slavery on the basis of the capitalist mode of production is unjust. So is cheating on the quality of commodities. That is, Marx distinguished ethics from what I will call morality. Morality, for example, bourgeois morality or Aztec morality or feudal morality or existing socialist morality, is the totality of effective, concrete historical practices, relations, ideologies, and so forth that justify the existing social and economic system. What Hegel would call the Sittlichkeit, that is the customs, what is customary, is cultural in that sense. I call ethics the practice, relations, customs, and so on, and the theory that transcendentally criticized morality. In this way, Marx critiqued, and Capital is a critique of political economy, and not merely a positive political economy, the bourgeois economy. That is, Marx critiqued the bourgeois economy, both the real economy and its supposed scientific theory, which is actually a fetishism, deconstructed its categories one by one and reconstructing them in a system in which appear the hidden ethical contradictions, like, for example, surplus value as unpaid labor. The unpaid component of labor that produces surplus value as surplus labor is invisible to bourgeois morality, but it is not invisible to Marx's critique, to this transcendental ethic. Marx then has a transcendental reference point to the totality of capital and its morality, from which he can critique that totality from the exteriority of living labor. This is a material living labor. Marx wrote, classical economy occasionally contradicts itself. This is, however, a necessary consequence of its analytic method with which criticism and understanding must begin. Classical economy is not interested in elaborating how the various forms come into being, but seeks to reduce them to their unity by means of analysis, because it starts from the given premises. But analysis is the necessary prerequisite of the genetical presentation of the understanding of the real formative process in its different phases. Finally, a failure, a deficiency of classical political economy is the fact that it does not conceive the basic form of capital, i.e., production designed to appropriate other people's labor, as a historical form, but as a natural form of social production. Living labor, the fundamental category, the entire dialectical development is presupposed as a natural determination of capital. The subsumption from exteriority has been denied, the ethical or critical moment par excellence, and the departure point is always already constituted capital. The development of all of these hypotheses is carried out in my three works, to which we should refer to establish, finally, with many supporting references, what we suggest in this short article, which has as its goal not the exposition of the subject, but rather the indication of a possible path to be traversed in the necessary and reconstruction of the thought of Marx. So this is just an amused bouche. Faced with perestroika, the opening of Eastern Europe, and the return of the imperialist wars in Central America and Africa and Asia, Marxism must return to its sources and beyond post-Marxism, reinterpret the totality of Marx's work to make common cause the new critique of late capitalism. of democratic socialism in the East and of the nationalist, popular, and Marxist revolutionary liberation movements of the poor and exploited capitalist periphery. The overcoming of indigenous and Stalinist dialectical materialism, simplistic economism, leftist teleological historicism, and dogmatism as a theoretical position demands a necessary continuation of the theoretical task of Marx developing, with his own method, a radical and coherent discourse that our time awaits. It is a matter of returning to Marx's text itself to become aware of the changing reality at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, the second century of Marx. So, let me conclude read the whole conclusion. The 4 drafts available to researchers for the first time in the history of Marxism in the MEGA offers us the possibility, with the enthusiasm of youth, with the knowledge that everything is not known, of exploring along paths lost in the forest never traveled. Although it may appear pretentious, the theoretical inheritance of Marx is still in great part of the future. It's not difficult to understand why it is in the periphery of capitalism that lives in its tortured skin and its massacred bodies, the contradiction of that central capitalism from which will come the proposals with the greatest sense of history. For us, revolution is not a hypothesis. It is a necessity that the people claim in their hunger, in their pain. If the theoreticians decree it impossible, the people would prove it in their praxis, its urgent necessity as a demand of life. Theory follows praxis. It does not anticipate it. Critique follows hunger and theoretically justifies the utopia of the desire to eat. The hope of eating triumphs over all the diets that the discipline of the obese impose upon themselves in their abundance, originating in the injustice that is the foundation of the death of the poor. And because poor, pauper, that is, wrote Marx, the condition of the possibility of the reproduction of world capital, central and peripheral. So it ends on kind of a slightly hopeful yet dismal note. But I think that's the spirit with which Dussel is approaching the problem. And, there's a certain joy about, a kind of looking at it like people look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. The MEGA is finally available and we can all get to the truth of the matter. Well, we don't. What we do get is clarification on the multiple concepts, things that are not quite as clear when you take the German and then turn it into English, or turn it into Spanish and then turn it to English, which is what Dussel is doing. And so, you sort of have to work through some of these things. And not that it's indeterminate. It is not indeterminate. I would say that there's a kind of family resemblance or a semantic terrain or something that kind of connects all these things. And you can see it operative when you go through this path, and it always is a path, and they're not discrete categories. So the categories are integrated, as we looked at, because they appear as circuits. So that's the whole deal, is that it's always moving, it's always, it is subsuming itself, and it is making sense that because it has contradictions built within it, that we constantly need to examine because it's always moving. And this is, it's problematic, but, kind of that's the way it is. So I got to the end. And so you can talk now. Are there queries in the chat?
Well, if I might say, that was quite moving in the end.
Yeah, indeed. Very Latin in that sense.
Yes. But it put together so many things so well. And then it was a call to action, every bit as good as the manifesto, in my opinion. So thank you so much.
Yes, I would say that this article compresses what he spends 3 volumes on, but I think that's what always these kind of analyses do, that you do all this analysis, and then you come back to the issue of, well, things are still moving, so we can have radical or activist activity, and I like thinking that's where every one of these happen. Thank you, Anna, for reminding us that Trump's felony sentencing would be tomorrow, which got pushed off until September or so. Oh God. I like thinking that you can see all those contradictions. You can see that there's all this bribery that's going on. Clarence Thomas, I think, averaged was it 40,000 a year? Or no, 400,000 a year of bribery for a decade. He had $4 million over a decade. Yes, forgiven loans, just like no, Brett Kavanaugh. Almost $250,000 in debt disappeared.
No, it's a gratuity. Don't you know that?
Oh, it's a gift.
You're allowed to bribe someone as long as you bribe them after they do the thing. That is basically what they said. It's okay. You just can't bribe them. You can't give them the money before they pass the legislation. It's one thing to pass, but if you pass it after, then it's just a gratuity. Like tipping your doorman at Christmas. Same thing. No different in the eyes of the Supreme Court.
Oh, God. Yeah, but if you took student loans, well, what were you thinking? Exactly. Yes. So anyway, the point of Dussel, just to, put a fine point on it, is that he's doing what a variety of other folks have been doing for the last 20 years or so. And that is trying to work through the fact that there's more material available. It all needs to be placed in sort of historical positions, and it needs further explication. Heinrich is an example of that, but he's not the definitive answer. And as I said, the announcement came in April, but the actual printing of this latest new translation of Volume 1 of Capital is coming out in September. So we'll see whether that one has anything, is better, let's put it that way. And of course, if you really want to pre-order it, Princeton University Press is. I don't think you get it any faster if you pre-order. But on the other hand, well, no, there'll be there's an electronic version. So, if you have a book fetish, then you'll have a problem.
Just in time for the holidays.
Yes. Maybe it'll come out on Labor Day. We'll see.
Is it going to come included with a copy of the Communist Manifesto, the way the Trump Bible comes included a copy of the Constitution?
Appendices and all that sort of stuff. Yes, you're right, Nancy. Pre-ordering books helps boost overall sales. Well, it will be free. I'm quite sure that whoever gets the first ebook is going to spend time converting it into a free object, a liberated object. But it does suggest that generations of people have been reading Marx in various limited or restricted ways, and I think we're finally getting around to a place where you can have a much more flexible reading of Marx. Because that's what Dussel is referring to. The fact is that Stalinism, overdetermined some some viewpoint on certain ideas, and some people followed it to the letter, or not so much to the letter, but you know, there is a point at which, you know, the polemic or the rhetoric refers to annihilation, you know, that class war exists, and therefore you have to annihilate bourgeois classes or annihilate the class distinction, which is an idea that is sort of lost in certain Russian contexts. The idea that people like Putin will not or do not refer to the period, you know, of the Soviet Union, but rather, you know, emulate the Tsar. You know, this implemented a 30-year plan of trying to shift, you know, the meaning of what it means to be a Russian to its feudal origins or pre-capitalist origin. That's the kind of imagery, right? You've got the czarist double eagle and, you know, the original red, white, and blue colors to sort of delimit the use of the hammer and sickle flag, etc. And yet they can't give it up on you know, military day, on the May Day celebrations. You can't give it up. I mean, because that's what was flying during World War II, the Great Patriotic War. Yes, techno-feudalism. It is kind of what we're referring. You know, we've kind of returned to it in a bunch of ways, but yet techno-feudalism is simply that technology has given us a kind of way in which, another means by which people can be oppressed.
Well, all the tech lords have a hard-on for Putin. You know, Thiel and
yeah.
Musk.
Well, you
Well,
know,
all that lot love Putin. So, you know.
well, they love it. Yeah, I mean, he gives them a deal. You know, he allows them to, you know, collect their profits, essentially. Fertilizer and iron ore and
Yeah.
natural gas, etc. Yeah,
Russia still has a lot of resources. It's kind of big, isn't it?
yeah,
Pretty big. It's like vast wasteland, untapped, unwhatevered. Because it's really not very habitable. That's a lot of
no,
it.
and the people who do inhabit it, you know, are such diverse groups. I mean, you know, you have whole Muslim minorities, all kinds of Asian, you know, cultures that are, with respect in the Ukrainian context, are being used as cannon fodder.
Yes.
And that's one thing. And the sub story to that is that you know, there are Indian volunteers, that is, volunteers from South Asia, you know, fighting alongside the Russians. And so that's a kind of weird thing. That's why Modi has been sucking up to Putin. It's very weird stuff that's going on. Very weird stuff going on. Elon Musk's mom. Oh, God.
Naughty B.
Elon, what a guy.
He just tweeted about some waste of money, waste of taxpayers' money. Thinks nobody should get tax money, and he's had £15 billion worth of government subsidy.
That's
I left
right.
him a little message. I left a little message with that. I might be getting kicked off X.
Well, that's there's a contradiction there.
Yeah.
But it is amazing how capitalists talk like that. You know,
Yeah.
as though that's what false conscience is about. You know, you just
Feeding people. What a
just
waste. What a waste it's feeding people. Give it to me. I want to wank off into space. You know.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I haven't been paying attention to the Boeing, those folks who are stuck up in the space station. They haven't come back yet, I think. It, I think because they're because the module broke or something.
That module is called Fux, not Max. FUX. Uh,
I think
77
that's the deal.
Fux.
Is that there's something wrong with it? There's some thing they got to fix on it, and I'm not sure how, that they can or should or will, but they're going to be stuck up there for a while.
You know, they've never been the same since they got rid of Bill Withers. They used to make their toilets. They've gone downhill ever since. That's what it is. The toilet's broke on the capsule. That's what it is. Yeah.
Well, we're at the end. Thank you very much. I will sign off, Joe. Time. Thank you for enduring more this and that. I hope it was at least useful to give you the chronological order of kind of the four manuscripts of Marx. That there, that there is an order to it, and in fact, the order is very important and useful to understand it because it helps explicate the different things. When Heinrich was in the U.S. the last time, or not the last time, but several years ago, he spent most of his time describing this exact issue of the sequence in which things are being written and what was available and not available, and he had to go through that, and that's kind of what he does in what Heinrich does in his book. Anyway. Thank you all for your attention, and we will see you anon with more of the same.
I would like to apologize for swears. I forgot it was live.
Ah,
Keep forgetting it's
Scheist.
live.
Scheist.
Oh,
Also Scheist.
yes.
Joe?
Vaffanculo. Todo ragazzo.
Joe may be asleep. It is possible for me to can I kill it on my end? No, I can't. I can't kill it.
Joseph.
Got to kill the live stream.
Sure.
I will stop
go.
sharing.
No.
We're still live on YouTube.
Oh, hello, YouTube. Oh, one person's watching.
Well,
Where is you?
I'll warn you that we're still on YouTube. I can sign off and sign on again to kill it.
All right.
May have to do so. I may disappear for a bit. Talk amongst yourselves. There's plenty of stuff to discuss. Spirituality is on later tonight at 8:30. I can't remember what they're going to do. There was the text that they were going to cover. I think it was on white culture or something. White poverty. That's it. An interesting question and of course really important. Talk about primitive accumulation. So I will return to come back and kill off the YouTube. This will take a bit. So just simply don't swear, and or if you want to share other stuff, share other stuff. But this may take a little bit, as you probably.
And I say poo. This is the TAC.
This is silent ASMR.
Here comes Andy to turn you all off. Oh, she didn't. Where is she? Joseph.
Patience, Padawan, patience.
Mm. It's taken me an hour to climb down from the ceiling, Warren.
Why? What's the matter, man?
England just got through to the final of the Euros with a tremendous last-minute goal. Like, I mean, the ridiculously brilliant last-minute goal. And I was screaming my head off. It was brilliant.
Well, congratulations, Lane. That's
Superb.
awesome. I've had a lot of soccer fans in my car recently.
Mm,
Canada just played Argentina yesterday here at MetLife Stadium in the
mm.
Copa America Cup or something like that.